Winter pressed heavy on the silent town. Lucas, just 12, wrapped in a red scarf his mother once knitted, stepped into the snow. Beside him moved Shadow, the war dog his father had trained long ago. The boy had lost a mother. The dog had lost a soldier. But in the storm they found each other. Every howl of the wind carried a memory. Every paw print in the snow was a promise. This winter would test them both and forge a bond unbroken by time. The town of White Hill, tucked in the northern reaches of the United States, had a way of disappearing under winter's relentless grip. By late December, snow blanketed every street and rooftop in a thick, unbroken layer, while icicles hung like teeth from the eaves of the old brick buildings downtown. The air carried a sharp bite, the kind that made even the simplest errand feel like a test of endurance. The wind rolled in off the frozen lake to the west, cutting through the narrow streets, rattling window panes, and scouring the hills with icy fingers. In this season, the bare-limbed maples stood rigid and silver in their coats of frost, and even the dogs in town hesitated before stepping outside. It was the kind of winter where the quiet felt heavier, as though the snow itself swallowed every sound. Inside a weathered cedar cabin perched halfway up a hill on the outskirts, a 12-year-old boy named Lucas sat by the wide front window, his breath fogging the glass as he watched the snow drift down in lazy spirals. Lucas had the lean build of a boy who spent more time outdoors than in, with a shock of dark blonde hair that never seemed to lie flat, and eyes the color of winter steel. Calm, but holding something deeper, a reservoir of old grief that no child should carry. He wore a thick navy sweater, 2 sizes too big, its sleeves fraying at the cuffs, and a pair of worn jeans patched at the knees. Lucas had lost his mother when he was 6, taken suddenly by an illness that came and went faster than anyone expected. His father, a soldier with the U.S. Army, had been his anchor afterward. A tall, broad-shouldered man with dark brown hair kept close cropped, a neatly trimmed beard, and a quiet steadiness that drew respect without effort. 2 years ago, during a classified mission overseas, that anchor was cut loose. His father never came home. Since then, Lucas had lived with his grandmother Eleanor Hayes in this old cabin that smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke. Eleanor was in her late 60s, her back straight despite years of tending gardens and hauling firewood, with hair like silvered snow swept into a neat bun, and eyes that had once been bright blue, but had softened to a pale, watery hue. Her face carried the fine lines of a life lived through both joy and loss, and she had a voice that could be as gentle as a lullaby or as firm as the crack of a frozen branch. She spoke little about her own grief. Instead, she filled her days with routines, stirring pots of stew on the wood stove, mending Lucas's clothes, and keeping the house warm enough to hold back the cold that pressed in from every seam. Yet Lucas's closest companion, the one who seemed to understand him without a word, was not human at all. Lying a few feet away from the window was Shadow, a 9-year-old German shepherd with the solid, muscular frame of a working dog, and a coat of deep black, marked only by a few silver strands along his muzzle and above his eyes. Ears stood tall and alert, the tips twitching at every distant sound, and his amber eyes carried a mixture of focus and warmth that seemed almost human. Shadow had served alongside Lucas's father in the military's K-9 unit, trained in search and rescue and detection. In his prime, he had been the kind of dog that soldiers trusted with their lives. Fast, disciplined, and unyielding in the face of danger. After Lucas's father was killed, Shadow was retired from service, and Eleanor had fought through a wall of military paperwork to make sure the dog came home to live with them. From that day on, Shadow had become more than just a pet. He was a living connection to the man Lucas still called Dad in his thoughts. Outside, the wind gusted hard enough to make the old cabin creak. Lucas shifted on the window seat, drawing his knees up and wrapping his arms around them. He watched Shadow's chest rise and fall in a slow rhythm, the dog's breathing steady despite the storm outside. Lucas often wondered if Shadow remembered his father the way he did. In flashes of moments, the scent of pine from the training fields, the sound of boots crunching on gravel. Sometimes, when the wind whistled just right, Shadow would lift his head and stare at the door, as if expecting someone to walk in. Those were the times Lucas would cross the room, sink his fingers into Shadow's thick fur, and feel the steady heartbeat beneath. Eleanor appeared from the kitchen, carrying 2 mugs of cocoa that steamed in the dim light. She set one down beside Lucas and the other on the floor near Shadow, who lapped it up. It was a special dog-safe blend Eleanor made from warm goat's milk and a bit of honey. "Storm's picking up," Eleanor said, her voice low but carrying a matter-of-fact tone. "If it keeps up, we might be snowed in for a few days." Lucas nodded without looking away from the window. "I don't mind," he said. "Shadow likes the snow." Eleanor's lips curved in a faint smile. "That he does. Your father used to say Shadow was born for winter." The mention of his father settled between them like the snow outside. Silent, inevitable. Eleanor didn't say more, and Lucas didn't push. They had learned to carry their grief in parallel lines, intersecting only when necessary. The afternoon light faded early, as it always did this time of year, and by the time Eleanor lit the oil lamp on the table, the world outside had been swallowed by swirling white. Lucas sipped his cocoa slowly, his gaze fixed on the hill below, where the single road into town was now nearly invisible. A lone figure moved along it, tall, bundled in a heavy parka, a knit cap pulled low. It was Mr. Howard, their nearest neighbor, a retired postal worker with a limp from a fall he'd taken decades ago on an icy stairwell. He raised a gloved hand in greeting as he passed, and Lucas waved back through the glass. Mr. Howard had a face perpetually reddened by wind, cold, and a voice that rasped from years of pipe smoking. But he was known for keeping an eye on the scattered homes along the hill. Lucas liked him well enough, though their conversations rarely lasted more than a few words shouted over the wind. Shadow, sensing the movement, rose to his feet, tail flicking once, before settling again. "He's checking the road," Eleanor observed. "Good man, that one." Lucas murmured agreement, but his thoughts were already drifting. He remembered stories his father had told him about working with Shadow, how the dog could track a scent through a blizzard, or sit perfectly still for hours if the mission required. He remembered, too, the day Shadow arrived at the cabin, stepping out of the back of a military transport van with the same steady composure he carried now. Lucas had been nervous at first, unsure if the dog would accept him, but Shadow had walked straight to him, pressed his head into Lucas's chest, and stood there as if to say, "You're mine now." The wind rattled the glass again, pulling Lucas back to the present. He glanced at Shadow, who was watching him with those steady amber eyes. The boy smiled faintly. "We'll go out tomorrow, boy," he said. "See how deep the snow is by the lake." Shadow's ears pricked forward at the sound of his name, and his tail swept once against the floor. Tomorrow the world would still be frozen, the hills still white and silent. But Lucas knew he wouldn't be alone out there. He never was, not with Shadow by his side. In the dim warmth of the cabin, with the storm raging just beyond the walls, Lucas leaned back into the window seat. Shadow settled beside him, head resting on the boy's knee, and together they watched the snow pile higher, knowing that winter in White Hill was always a test, but one they would face together. The storm that had battered White Hill through the night had eased by morning, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt as though the whole world was holding its breath. Snow lay deep and untouched across the hills, sculpted by the wind into smooth drifts that caught the pale winter sunlight and threw it back in a dazzling glare. Lucas stood at the front door of the cabin, fastening the buttons of his thick parka, the red wool scarf his mother had knitted years ago wound snugly around his neck. The scarf was slightly frayed at the ends, but the warmth it carried was more than physical. It was a tether to a memory, to a pair of gentle hands that had once wrapped it around him before sending him out to play in the snow. He tugged on his wool hat, pulled his gloves tight, and reached for the old leather leash hanging by the door. Shadow, who had been pacing with quiet anticipation since sunrise, gave a short, eager bark. The dog's coat gleamed even in the muted daylight, black fur dusted with silver around his muzzle, the thick winter undercoat making him look broader and more imposing than usual. His eyes, a steady amber, fixed on Lucas as if awaiting permission for what they both knew was coming. "All right, boy," Lucas said with a grin that reached only halfway up his face. "Let's go see what the storm left us." Eleanor appeared in the kitchen doorway, wiping her hands on a faded blue dish towel. She was dressed for the day in her wool skirt, thick stockings, and a quilted vest over a flannel shirt, her silver hair braided neatly down her back. "Don't go farther than the lake," she cautioned. "The snow's deep and the air's colder than it looks, and keep an eye on the ice." Lucas nodded. "We'll be back before lunch." The door opened with a groan, releasing a rush of cold so sharp it seemed to slice through the cabin's warmth. Shadow bounded out first, his paws sinking deep into the snow with a satisfying crunch. Lucas followed, the air so crisp it burned in his lungs. The world outside was transformed. The road had vanished beneath a thick quilt of white, the fences and hedges buried so that only their tops peeked out like the backs of sleeping beasts. They made their way down the hill toward the lake, Lucas's boots breaking the crust of snow with each step, Shadow leaping effortlessly from drift to drift. The path took them past Mr. Howard's place, though the windows of the old farmhouse were shuttered against the cold. At the bend where the trees began to crowd close to the trail, Lucas spotted someone ahead, a woman kneeling by a low fence, brushing snow from a small evergreen. She looked to be in her late 30s, tall and willowy, with long brown hair that escaped in loose strands from beneath a knitted cap. Her skin was pale from the winter, her cheeks flushed with the cold, and her eyes were an unusual shade of green that seemed almost luminous in the snowy light. She wore a thick wool coat, daidhi, color of moss and gloves that had been mended more than once. When she glanced up at Lucas, she offered a polite smile. "Morning," she said, her voice warm and carrying a faint lilt, as though she'd grown up somewhere far from Whitehill. "Morning," Lucas replied, slowing his pace. Shadow trotted ahead but kept his gaze on her, tail wagging once before he returned to Lucas's side. "You must be Eleanor's grandson," the woman said, standing and brushing snow from her coat. "I'm Sarah Thompson. I moved into the cabin down by the creek last month." She extended a gloved hand, and Lucas shook it, feeling the firm, confident grip. "Nice to meet you," he said. "This is Shadow." Sarah bent slightly to meet the dog's eyes, her smile widening. "He's beautiful. A K9, isn't he?" Lucas's brow lifted. "How'd you know?" "I used to work with rescue dogs," she said, straightening. "You can tell from the posture. They hold themselves differently, like they're still on duty." She gave Shadow an approving nod before stepping back. "Stay safe out there. The drifts near the lake get tricky after a storm." Lucas thanked her, and they continued on, but he found himself wondering about this new neighbor. There weren't many people who moved to Whitehill in the dead of winter. The lake came into view through the trees, a vast sheet of white under the pale sky. The wind had swept the snow in smooth ripples across the ice, but along the edges dark cracks veined the surface where the water still shifted beneath. Lucas remembered his father's voice, low and steady. "Shadow isn't just a dog. He's your guardian." He stopped near the shore, unclipped the leash, and pulled off one of his gloves. From his pocket he took a worn leather glove, his father's old training prop. "Find," he commanded, his tone firm but encouraging. Shadow's ears snapped forward, and he dropped his head, sniffing the air before bounding off into the drifts. Lucas watched as the dog zigzagged across the snow, pausing to dig here and there before locking onto a spot halfway to the tree line. With quick, practiced movements, Shadow pawed at the snow until the leather glove emerged, clenched gently in his jaws. He trotted back, tail high, and dropped it into Lucas's waiting hand. "Good boy," Lucas murmured, ruffling the thick fur at the base of his neck. They spent the next half hour repeating the game, Lucas burying the glove in deeper and more obscure spots, Shadow finding it every time. It was more than a game. It was keeping a skill alive, a link to a man who was gone, but whose presence still shaped their lives. As they prepared to head back, Lucas noticed footprints along the far edge of the lake, half filled with snow. They were too small to be Mr. Howard's, and too recent to be from before the storm. He hesitated, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing. Shadow followed his gaze, ears twitching, then looked back at Lucas, waiting. Lucas decided not to investigate further. Eleanor would worry if they stayed out too long. On the walk back, he thought again of Sarah and her knowing glance at Shadow, of the footprints by the lake, and of the way the winter air seemed sharper than usual, as though carrying a whisper of something unseen. When they reached the cabin, Eleanor was waiting on the porch, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug. "You were gone longer than I thought," she remarked, eyes narrowing slightly. "Everything all right?" "Yeah," Lucas said, unclipping Shadow's leash. "We just ran into someone new, Sarah Thompson. She's living down by the creek." Eleanor's brow lifted in mild surprise. "Didn't know anyone had moved in there. That place has been empty since the Harpers left." She sipped her drink, studying Lucas. "Did she seem all right?" Lucas shrugged. She's nice. Said she used to work with rescue dogs. Eleanor hummed, but said nothing more. Inside, Lucas hung his coat and scarf to dry, Shadow shaking snow from his fur before settling by the fireplace. The warmth of the cabin closed around them, but the images from the morning, the green-eyed woman, the mysterious footprints, lingered in Lucas's mind. Winter in Whitehill was usually quiet, predictable. But something about today made him feel that this season might be different. The day after their trip to the frozen lake, the weather turned even colder. The sun shone, but its light was thin, brittle, and without warmth, casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground. The wind had stilled, leaving the air heavy with the kind of silence that made every sound. Footsteps, the crack of a branch, the rustle of fabric, stand out like a shout. Lucas was at the small desk by the living room window, sketching the patterns of the hills outside, when Eleanor entered from the back room. She carried something in her hands, a plain, weathered envelope, its edges softened by time. "This came with the mail today," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "It's from the army." Lucas turned, curiosity flashing in his winter-gray eyes. Eleanor crossed the room, setting the envelope in front of him. "They must have found it in storage somewhere," she added, her fingers lingering on it for a moment before she stepped back. The envelope was thick, sealed with the kind of care that spoke of importance. Lucas ran his gloved fingers over the surface, tracing the familiar blocky handwriting of his father. His chest tightened. He opened it slowly, careful not to tear the paper, and slid out the contents. Several photographs and a single folded sheet. The photographs were worn at the corners, but clear. His father, standing tall in his military uniform, bundled against the cold, one hand resting on Shadow's back. In one, Shadow sat obediently beside a snowbank, his ears pricked, eyes locked on his handler. In another, his father knelt in the snow, gesturing toward a buried object, while Shadow dug eagerly. Lucas stared at them, each image a spark of life pulled from the past. The letter was brief, written in the same steady, deliberate script. "If my son is able to care for Shadow, let them look after each other. This dog is more than my partner. He's my friend, my protector, and the best part of the man I've tried to be." Lucas read it twice, then a third time, his eyes tracing the lines until they blurred. It wasn't just a note. It was a hand reaching out from somewhere he couldn't follow, pressing into his palm something that was both a responsibility and a gift. Shadow, who had been lying near the fire, rose silently and came to stand beside Lucas, resting his head on the boy's leg. Lucas stroked the coarse fur between his ears, swallowing the lump in his throat. "He knew we'd need each other," he whispered. Eleanor sat down across from him, her gaze softening. "Your father wrote that while he was stationed overseas. I remember when the photos were taken. He sent me a copy of one, said it was one of his proudest moments with Shadow." She paused, her voice catching just enough for Lucas to notice. "He wanted you to have these when you were ready." Lucas wanted to ask what ready meant, but before he could, the sharp sound of boots crunching on the porch interrupted them. The door swung open, letting in a gust of cold air along with Mr. Howard. He stamped the snow from his outs, his face flushed from the cold, his grizzled beard flecked with ice. "Afternoon," he greeted, his voice carrying the rasp of years spent outdoors in all weathers. "Eleanor, Lucas." He removed his gloves and blew into his hands. Saw someone walking near the lake earlier. Didn't recognize them. Eleanor frowned. Near the lake? Not many folks head out that way in this cold. Mr. Howard shook his head. Tall man, heavy coat, face covered. Didn't wave back when I called. His eyes shifted to Lucas briefly. You two been out there again? Lucas hesitated. Yesterday. Just me and Shadow. He thought of the footprints he'd seen, half covered in snow, but decided not to mention them yet. Mr. Howard glanced toward Shadow, who stood quietly, watching the older man with calm, assessing eyes. If you go that way again, keep him close, and keep your own eyes open. With that he gave a nod and stepped back out into the bright cold, the door closing behind him with a muted thud. Eleanor exchanged a look with Lucas, but neither spoke of the unease that had settled in the room. Instead, she rose and moved to the kitchen. We'll have stew tonight. You can bring in some more firewood. Lucas slipped the letter and photographs back into the envelope, tucking it into the top drawer of his desk. Later, after the woodpile was replenished and the smell of simmering stew filled the cabin, he found himself seated on the floor beside Shadow. The dog's amber eyes reflected the flicker of the firelight, and Lucas thought again of his father's words. Let them look after each other. That night, as snow began to fall again, Lucas lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind's low whistle. The images of his father and Shadow together stayed with him. But so did the picture of those strange footprints on the lake and Mr. Howard's mention of the tall man who didn't wave. White Hill was small, and strangers were rare in winter. Something in Lucas's gut told him the season was bringing more than just snow. Christmas Eve in White Hill should have been a night of quiet lamps glowing in windows, of distant church bells muffled by snow, and of families gathered closer to fireplaces. Instead, it arrived with the full force of a blizzard that clawed at the town from every direction. The wind howled through the streets like a living thing, carrying sheets of snow, so dense they blurred the line between earth and sky. By late afternoon, the temperature had dropped so sharply that frost traced intricate veins along the inside of the cabin windows, and even the wood stove labored to keep the rooms warm. Outside, the hill had vanished beneath a shifting, uneven sea of white. Lucas sat at the kitchen table, a pencil in hand, but no focus for the sketchbook in front of him. Eleanor moved between the stove and the counter, preparing what was meant to be their simple holiday dinner. Roast chicken, bread she'd baked that morning, and a jar of preserved cherries opened for the occasion. Her movements were precise, efficient, but Lucas could see the way her eyes kept flicking toward the window. The wind had a way of making you feel watched, even in the safety of your own home. Shadow lay curled by the fire, his head resting on his paws, but his ears twitched at every gust. By dusk, the storm had swallowed what little daylight remained. Then at just past 6, the house went dark. The stove still burned, but the lamps dimmed, and the low hum of the heater cut off entirely. Eleanor lit an oil lamp, setting it in the center of the table. "Power lines must be down," she said, her voice steady, though her brow furrowed. "We'll be fine. We've got the stove and the woodpile." It was then that a faint sound reached them. A long, drawn-out wail, low at first, and then rising until it cut cleanly through the wind. Lucas froze, head turning toward the door. "Did you hear that?" Eleanor paused, listening. The sound came again. It wasn't the wind. It was the town's emergency siren, the one used only for fires, rescues, or severe accidents. Lucas was on his feet before he knew it. His father had told him once that you didn't ignore that sound. It meant someone's life might depend on how fast you moved. Shadow lifted his head sharply, his amber eyes locked on the door, body tense. Eleanor's voice was firm. "Lucas, stay here. The weather." But Lucas was already moving to pull on his coat and scarf. "They wouldn't be sounding it unless it's bad. Shadow and I can help." She hesitated, torn between protecting him and recognizing the boy's stubbornness, something he'd inherited directly from his father. Finally, she said, "Stay close to town. If you're not back in an hour, I'm sending Howard after you." The moment Lucas stepped outside, the wind hit like a wall. Snow whipped across his face, stinging his cheeks, and the cold knifed through his gloves. Shadow pushed forward against the gale, his head lowered, moving with the deliberate, powerful gait of a dog who'd been trained for worse. They followed the road toward the center of town, where faint orange glows broke through the white, emergency lanterns outside the volunteer firehouse. Two figures emerged from the blur. One was Sheriff Caleb Morris, a man in his 50s with a barrel chest and a weathered face, his graying beard dusted with snow. Known for his steady patience, Caleb had been born in Whitehill and carried himself with the calm of someone who'd seen both blizzards and human tempers pass. The other was a younger man Lucas didn't recognize, broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy black parka, his jaw shadowed with a few days' beard. He had the wary look of someone unused to standing still, his eyes scanning constantly. Caleb's voice was raised over the wind. "Lucas Hayes, what in blazes are you doing out here?" Lucas stepped closer, heard the siren. "What happened?" Caleb glanced at Shadow, then back at the boy. Group of 3 went up near Pine Hollow earlier. 2 adults and a kid. Didn't make it back. We've got folks trying to reach them, but the snow's covering tracks faster than we can follow. The younger man spoke for the first time, his voice low, with a faint, gravelly edge. "The kid's young, can't be more than 6. We've got a general direction, but no clear trail." Shadow stood alert, ears pricked, glancing between the 2 men and Lucas. Lucas knew that look. It was the same one Shadow had given his father when orders came down in the field. "I can help," Lucas said, already unclipping Shadow's leash. "Shadow can track in snow. My dad trained him for this." Caleb hesitated. "It's dangerous. Visibility's terrible and it's getting worse." "He's not just any dog," Lucas insisted. "He's done it before." The younger man gave Caleb a short nod. "We could use the nose, and the kid knows the dog's signals better than anyone." Caleb let out a breath. "All right, but you stay with me, Lucas. You see me stop, you stop. Understood?" Lucas nodded, pulling his scarf higher. Shadow stepped forward, already catching the scent from the glove Caleb handed over. A child's mitten, damp and clinging with ice. The search party set off toward Pine Hollow, the snow crunching under their boots. The wind roared in the treetops, carrying with it the creak of bending branches and the occasional snap of ice. Shadow moved ahead in a purposeful zigzag, nose low, tail held level. Every few steps, he paused, glanced back at Lucas, and then pressed forward. They hadn't gone far when another figure emerged from the storm ahead. Sarah Thompson, the new neighbor, appeared through the swirling snow, her moss-green coat powdered white, her long brown hair escaping from under her hat. She was breathing hard, but her eyes were sharp. "I heard about the search," she said quickly. "I've worked winter rescues before. I know the terrain near the hollow." Caleb studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right, fall in. Stay behind the dog." They pushed on, the cold biting deeper, the snow nearly to Lucas's knees in places. Shadow led them across a narrow, frozen creek, up a slope where the wind drove the snow sideways in blinding sheets. Then suddenly, his bark cut through the storm, a sharp, urgent sound. He bounded toward a cluster of snow-laden pines, disappearing into the shadows beneath. Lucas stumbled after him, Caleb and the others close behind. In the hollow beneath the trees, they found them, a man and woman huddled around a small girl in a pink coat, her face pale, lips trembling. The adults were exhausted, their clothes soaked, their eyes wide with relief and fear. Shadow pressed close to the child, his body blocking the wind. Lucas pulled off his scarf, wrapping it around her neck. Sarah knelt beside them, checking the girl's hands and face for frostbite, her movements quick and practiced. "We need to move," Caleb said. "Storm's not letting up." They formed a tight group, shielding the child as they made their way back. Shadow stayed close to Lucas, glancing up every so often as if to make sure the boy was still steady on his feet. By the time the firehouse lanterns came into view again, Lucas's legs burned from the effort, his face numb from the cold. Inside, warmth and light rushed over them. The girl was wrapped in blankets, the adults given hot drinks. Caleb clapped Lucas on the shoulder, his expression unreadable but his voice warm. "You and that dog. Your father would have been proud." Lucas glanced at Shadow, who had settled on the floor near the girl, his head resting on his paws. For the first time that night, the boy allowed himself a small, tired smile. The firehouse was quieter now. The rescued family had been taken into the back room, where thick wool blankets and the warmth of portable heaters helped drive the chill from their bodies. Outside, the blizzard still raged, rattling the windows and pressing snow against the doors. But inside, there was a fragile pocket of safety. Lucas sat on a wooden bench near the wall, unfastening his coat and rubbing his hands together. Shadow lay at his feet, sides rising and falling steadily, his black fur still dusted with frost. The dog's amber eyes were half-lidded, but his ears flicked every time someone moved. Across the room, Sheriff Caleb Morris spoke quietly with one of the volunteers. The sheriff, a man whose square shoulders and deliberate speech conveyed a calm authority, glanced over at Lucas now and then, as if reassessing the boy not just as a neighbor's grandson, but as someone who had proven himself capable in a crisis. The rescued family soon emerged. The father, in his mid-30s, was tall and lean but gaunt from exhaustion. His dark hair was matted from the snow, and a faint scar ran along his jawline, a pale reminder of some old injury. He carried himself with the cautious movements of someone who had known hardship before this night. The mother, shorter and softer in build, had chestnut-brown hair pulled back in a low braid. Her face still held the pallor of the cold, but there was a strength in her eyes that suggested she had been the one urging the others to keep moving out there in the storm. The little girl between them was bundled so tightly in a fresh blanket that only her round face peeked out, her cheeks flushed from the heater's warmth. They approached Lucas. The father spoke first, his voice low but steady. "You're the one who found us?" Lucas shifted uncomfortably. "It was Shadow." He knew where to go. The man crouched, looking at the dog. Shadow's gaze met his, calm but appraising, as if weighing his intentions. The man reached out a hand but stopped just short, perhaps sensing that Shadow wasn't quick to trust strangers. "Thank you," he said simply before standing again. "I'm Mark Latham. This is my wife, Julia, and our daughter, Emily." Julia offered a faint smile. "We owe you our lives." Before Lucas could answer, Sarah stepped into the circle. Her green eyes moved between the Lathams and Lucas, then settled on Mark with a flicker of recognition so slight that only someone watching closely, like Lucas, would notice. "You should rest," she said to them, her tone gentle but leaving no room for argument. "I'll make sure you get something hot to drink." Mark hesitated before nodding. As Sarah led them toward a row of chairs near the heater, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to that brief look than polite acknowledgement. Sheriff Caleb approached, his boots sounding solid against the wooden floor. "Lucas, I'm going to write up the incident report in the morning. I'll need your account." He glanced down at Shadow. "And maybe I should put him on the payroll." Lucas smiled faintly. "He only works for food." The sheriff's expression softened. "You did good tonight, both of you." Then he was gone, moving to check in with the rest of the volunteers. Hours later, when the storm showed no signs of easing, Eleanor arrived at the firehouse, her silver hair damp from snow. Relief flooded her face when she saw Lucas. She crossed the room quickly, pulling him into a firm embrace. "I told you an hour," she murmured, but there was no sharpness in her tone, only gratitude. Her gaze shifted to Shadow. "And you, keeping him safe, like you promised his father." As they prepared to leave, Lucas glanced toward the Lathams. Julia was speaking softly to Emily, who clutched the scarf Lucas had given her earlier. Mark sat slightly apart, eyes lowered, while Sarah spoke to him in low tones. Lucas couldn't hear the words, but the tightness in Mark's shoulders told him it wasn't casual conversation. Stepping out into the storm again, Lucas pulled his scarf higher. The walk home was slow. The drifts were deep, and the wind drove snow into their faces. Shadow moved ahead, breaking a path through the whiteness. When they reached the cabin, Eleanor ushered them inside, shutting the door firmly against the cold. Later, as Lucas lay in bed, Shadow curled at his feet. His mind returned to the moment under the pine trees, the girl's pale face, the way her parents had clung to her, the determined bark of the dog at his side. It had been more than a rescue. It felt like the first page of something larger, though he couldn't yet see the shape of it. Somewhere in that storm, beyond the relief of the firehouse, threads had been tied between people, threads that might hold fast or pull taut in ways none of them could predict. The dawn broke pale and cold over the ridge, the kind of light that seemed to belong more to winter's silence than to the living world. Snow still covered the town like a thick quilt, the storm having eased some time before dawn. The air was painfully crisp, each breath stinging Lucas's lungs as he trudged along the path toward home. Shadow walked beside him, his paws leaving neat impressions in the untouched snow, steam curling from his muzzle with each breath. The firehouse had been quieter when they left, most of the volunteers sleeping in chairs or dozing against the walls after the long night. Mark Latham had shaken Lucas's hand firmly before they parted, the gratitude in his eyes unspoken but heavy. Julia had smiled softly, holding Emily close in her arms, and the little girl had managed a shy wave before burying her face in her mother's coat. Lucas's grandmother, Eleanor, walked just ahead, her thick wool coat buttoned all the way to the collar. Even at 68, she had the erect posture of someone who'd never allowed the hardships of life to bow her. Her silver hair was tucked neatly under a knitted cap, and her face, lined yet strong, was set in a look of quiet pride. She said little on the walk, perhaps knowing that Lucas's thoughts were still lingering in the firehouse. When they reached the cabin, the familiar sight of its snow-laden roof and thin chimney smoke was like a hand placed gently on the shoulder. Eleanor went inside first, moving toward the kitchen to light the stove. Lucas stayed outside a moment longer, staring at the horizon where the sun had begun to edge over the hills, casting golden light across the frozen world. It was the kind of morning his father might have loved, the kind that felt both still and full of possibilities. Inside, Shadow shook himself vigorously, sending tiny ice crystals scattering across the floor. Lucas rubbed the dog's head, feeling the warmth of him seep into his fingers. "We did good," he murmured. Shadow's tail gave a slow wag, his eyes calm but watchful. The smell of coffee soon filled the kitchen, rich and comforting. Eleanor poured a cup for herself and slid a steaming mug of cocoa toward Lucas. "You'll be sore tomorrow," she remarked, her voice matter-of-fact but tinged with affection. "But it's a good kind of sore." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the only sound the soft hiss of the wood stove and the occasional pop of sap in the fire. Then after a sip of coffee, Eleanor said, "The Lathams. I've seen that man before." Lucas's head lifted. "Where?" Her brows drew together faintly. "It was years ago. Your father was still in the service. There was a photograph in the paper, an article about a rescue overseas. I'm almost certain Mark Latham was standing in the background, behind the squad." Lucas frowned. "You think he knew Dad?" Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. "Perhaps. Or perhaps it's just my memory playing tricks. Still, something in the way he looked at you, and at Shadow." The thought stuck with Lucas throughout the morning. He busied himself with chores, bringing in more firewood, sweeping snow from the porch. But each time his mind wandered, it went back to the firehouse, to the brief look between Sarah and Mark. There'd been recognition there, and not the kind that came from a passing acquaintance. Later, while Eleanor dozed in her chair and Shadow lay stretched out on the rug, Lucas decided to walk into town. The snow had been plowed from the main road, and the air was clear, almost painfully bright under the sun. He found himself drawn toward the firehouse again, as though some answer might still be waiting there. The building was mostly empty now, but through the slightly open door to the back office, Lucas heard voices, low, urgent. He recognized Sarah's voice, calm but edged with something sharper than her usual warmth. "You can't keep running from it, Mark. He deserves to know the truth." Mark's reply was quieter, rough around the edges. "And what good would that do? He's just a boy. It would only open old wounds." There was a pause. Lucas held his breath, pressing himself against the wall, the cool draft from the open door brushing his cheek. Sarah spoke again, softer this time. "Some wounds don't heal in silence. They just sink deeper." Lucas stepped back before they could emerge, his heart pounding. He didn't know what they meant, but the certainty that it had something to do with his father rooted itself firmly in his chest. By the time he returned home, The sun was low again, gilding the snow with fading light. Eleanor was stirring a pot of stew, the warm scent filling the cabin. Shadow padded in behind Lucas, shaking snow from his fur. The boy glanced at the old photographs on the mantel. His father in uniform, smiling with a younger Shadow at his side, and felt a weight he couldn't yet name settle on him. Somehow he knew the storm had only just begun. The evening settled over the cabin with the hush of falling snow, the kind of deep quiet that made the crackle of the fire sound almost like a voice from another time. Eleanor moved with deliberate care, a small wooden frame in her hands. She placed it on the mantel, right beside the older photograph of Lucas's father in uniform. The new picture, taken just that morning by Sarah at the firehouse, showed Lucas kneeling in the snow with Shadow at his side, both dusted in white. Lucas's cheeks were flushed from the cold, his grin wide and unguarded. Shadow's dark eyes caught the light just right, as though he too understood what the moment meant. Lucas stared at it for a long while. The two photographs together felt like a bridge across years. Father and son, both framed by winter, both with the same loyal dog at their side. "We did it, Dad," he whispered, his voice barely louder than the fire's sigh. Shadow, lying by the hearth, raised his head and thumped his tail once, before settling again, eyes half closed but alert. Eleanor glanced over from her rocking chair. "You've got his smile, you know," she said, her tone gentle but threaded with memory. "Your father, he had a way of smiling like he'd already forgiven the world for whatever it might do next." Lucas tilted his head. "Did he ever tell you things? About his missions?" Eleanor's hands paused on her knitting needles. "Some. Not enough to make sense of them. He carried most of it inside. Soldiers do that." She looked at the fire, her eyes far away. "But he trusted Shadow more than anyone. That dog knew things even I didn't." The conversation left Lucas restless. Later that night, when the fire had burned low and Eleanor had gone to bed, he sat at the table turning the photograph over in his hands. On the back, faint pencil marks caught his attention. Coordinates written in his father's slanted hand. They weren't labeled, but Lucas had seen enough maps in geography class to recognize them. The next morning dawned with a pale sun, the sky a brittle blue. Lucas tucked the photograph into his coat pocket and set out with Shadow toward the woods. The snow crunched beneath his boots, and the air carried the sharp scent of pine. Shadow moved with quiet purpose, his ears swiveling at every sound, his breath steaming in the cold. The coordinates led them along an old path Lucas had only half remembered, a narrow trail winding up a hill where the snow lay deeper and the trees grew closer together. At a bend in the path, Shadow stopped abruptly, nose to the ground. His tail gave a slow, deliberate wag, the kind he used when he was on a scent worth following. They reached a small clearing half hidden by drifts. In the center stood a crumbling stone chimney, all that remained of a cabin long gone. Lucas approached, brushing snow from the hearthstones. There, tucked deep in a crack between stones, was a metal tin, its surface dulled with age. His hands trembled as he worked it free. Inside were items wrapped in oilcloth, a folded letter, a silver tag engraved with Shadow's name, and a photograph Lucas had never seen before. It showed his father with Mark Latham, both in uniform, standing in front of a snow-covered ridge. Between them sat a younger Shadow, ears perked, wearing the same tag Lucas now held. Lucas sat back on his heels, the cold forgotten. The letter, written in his father's firm, direct script, began, "If you are reading this, son, then Shadow is with you, and I am not." The rest blurred as his eyes stung. His father wrote of missions in frozen places, of trust earned in silence, of a friend named Mark who had once saved his life. And then near the end, a line that made Lucas catch his breath. "There are things only Mark can tell you. Find him when you are ready." Shadow nudged his arm gently, as if sensing the weight of the moment. Lucas looked into those steady eyes, the silver in Shadow's fur catching the morning light. "We'll find him," Lucas murmured. "Together." By the time they returned to the cabin, the sun was already dipping toward the horizon. Lucas tucked the tin safely under his bed, the photograph of his father and Mark placed carefully inside his desk. He knew the quiet of the snow wouldn't last forever. Questions had been planted now, and answers waited somewhere beyond the next ridge. That night, as the wind picked up and the fire threw dancing shadows on the walls, Lucas lay awake listening to Shadow's steady breathing at the foot of his bed. The photograph by the hearth glowed faintly in the firelight. 2 winters and 2 lives connected by one enduring promise. The winter sun hung low over Pine Brook, casting a gold sheen across the snowbanks that lined every street. Though the air still bit at the skin, Lucas felt something new in its chill, something that no longer gnawed at his spirit. The heaviness that had once made every winter morning harder to greet had softened, replaced by a quiet steadiness. Eleanor, bundled in her thick wool sweater, was by the stove stirring a pot of soup. Her silver hair, always neatly tied in a bun, gleamed in the light from the kitchen window. She caught Lucas watching her and smiled with that mixture of pride and relief only grandmothers carried. "You've been out more these days," she said, ladling broth into a bowl. "Not hiding in your room so much. I think Shadow's to thank for that." Shadow, curled near the door, lifted his head at the sound of his name. At nearly 10 years old, his muzzle had grown peppered with white, but his stance was still straight, his eyes still sharp. He had the look of a guardian who had seen too much to ever truly rest, yet softened when Lucas was near. That morning, Lucas had decided to write to Mark Latham. The coordinates and the letter from his father had turned over in his mind for days, and while he wasn't ready for a meeting just yet, he wanted Mark to know he existed, that Shadow was with him, and that the promise his father left was being kept. He sat at the kitchen table with Eleanor's old fountain pen, the same one she used to sign every Christmas card. The words came slowly but with conviction. "My name is Lucas Carter. My father was Daniel Carter. I have Shadow now. I think you knew him. I think you knew my father in ways I never could. I would like to hear his stories." Eleanor read the letter silently when he finished. Her eyes glistened, though she said nothing, simply nodding and placing a hand over his. "The truth isn't always easy, Lucas, but it's yours to seek." The following week, a reply came, handwritten on paper that smelled faintly of cedar. Mark's handwriting was careful, deliberate, like a man who weighed every word before it left him. "Lucas, I knew your father well. He saved my life once, and I tried to save his in return. I have things to tell you, but they are best spoken in person. If you wish, I will come to Pine Brook before the snow thaws." The day Mark arrived, the wind carried the scent of oncoming snow. Lucas stood on the porch, Shadow at his side, as a dark green pickup pulled up the driveway. The man who stepped out was in his late 40s, tall with a lean, wiry frame. His hair was streaked with gray, cropped short, and his jaw was shadowed with a few days' stubble. A thin scar ran from his left temple to the edge of his cheek, a souvenir from a life lived too close to danger. His eyes, pale blue and unflinching, softened only when they fell on Shadow. Shadow bounded forward with a sharp bark, tail wagging, a recognition so immediate it stole Lucas's breath. Mark dropped, to one knee in the snow, letting the dog press his head into his chest. "Hey, old man," Mark murmured, voice thick. "Still watching over your boys, huh?" Inside, over mugs of hot cocoa and the steady hum of the fire, Mark began to talk. He spoke of missions in places colder than Pine Brook, where days bled into nights, and the only constant was the trust between men and their dogs. He told Lucas about the time Shadow tracked a missing soldier through a whiteout storm, saving him from freezing. About the way his father always kept his men laughing, even when rations were thin and hope thinner. But the stories weren't all bright. Mark's voice tightened when he spoke of the mission that took Daniel's life. "We were supposed to come home together," he said, staring into the flames. "But he made a choice that meant I could see my kids again." He looked at Lucas then, the weight of survivor's guilt written plainly across his face. "He told me, if he didn't make it, to look after you. I didn't know how. Until now." Lucas felt the room tilt slightly, the truth landing heavier than he'd expected. Yet there was no bitterness, only a clearer picture of the man his father had been. "He would be glad you're here," Lucas said quietly. They spent the rest of the afternoon going through the tin Lucas had found, Mark filling in the stories behind each item. By the time evening fell and the first flakes began to drift down again, Lucas realized something profound. Winter hadn't changed, but he had. The cold was no longer an enemy. It was a season stitched with memory, courage, and connection. That night, as Eleanor dozed in her chair and the fire threw gentle light across the photographs on the mantel, Lucas sat on the floor with Shadow's head in his lap. Outside, snow blanketed the world in silence. But inside there was warmth enough for three. For the first time since he could remember, winter felt like home. Sometimes the greatest miracles are not the ones that change the world in a flash, but the quiet ones that change a single heart forever. Lucas's winter was once cold and lonely, but God, in his own time, sent the warmth of friendship, memory, and love through a loyal companion and the people he placed along the way. And just as the snow melts to make way for spring, so can our hearts thaw when touched by his grace. If you believe in his miracles, whether grand or small, carry them into your daily life. Be kind, be patient, love deeply, and when you see someone lost in their own winter, be the warmth they are praying for. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs a little hope today. Leave your thoughts in the comments and subscribe so we can keep sharing more moments like this together. May God bless you and your loved ones, and may His light guide your every step.